We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
So welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. So over the course of the last 6 months or so, I've of course been using ChatGPT nearly daily, like I'm sure many of you have, but also listening to other podcasts on generative AI, and I think having really interesting discussions with people around me. And with all of this, one of the ideas kind of in the back of my mind for all this time has been how will these kind of implicit biases or the biases that the AI programmers that are generating these AI models, how will these biases impact the world as our use in AI grows exponentially? So especially if we start using ChatGPT and other large language models, competitors like Bard, etc., more so than Google as our primary way of accumulating information and searching for information online. So I think that also most people are only kind of vaguely familiar with the biases and problems already inherent in Google and its search functionalities, let alone AI. So it might be that having this kind of new version of search will be so shocking or overwhelming to the average person, I guess in kind of, the way that it's being used, the functionalities, the benefits, etc., that the consequences of these biases will be too much to wrap our heads around kind of before it's too late. So I've been fortunate enough to have guests in the past come on and discuss some of the problems of AI bias and the subsequent consequences that come from that bias, even before the kind of generative AI exploded onto the mainstream. But I don't think any of my guests or even myself thought that these consequences would become so large scale so quickly, not to mention the problems that may come out in the next 5 to 10 years if things continue kind of unabated. So even though there is a discussion on AI bias and what it might mean out there in the larger podcast world or online in general, I think the more voices speaking out about it, raising it up as an issue, the better. So maybe there's a little bit of starting context for this episode. So let's quickly look at online search very briefly, and then we'll dive into AI bias and how it's already impacted and will impact a number of other aspects in society. So very quickly, Search 1.0 was kind of the first generation of search engines from roughly the early 1980s to the 1990s, and it focused primarily on keyword matching. Users would input certain keywords, and the search engine would return pages that contained those keywords. It was pretty straightforward, but a rather limited approach. And then Search 2.0 came about in the late 1990s, and it brought in a more personalized and context-aware approach. So this generation of search engines started to consider the user's past behavior, location, and other context to deliver more relevant results. It also included semantic search capabilities, which is pretty important, where the search engines began to understand the user's intent behind the search rather than just focusing on the very basic keywords. And then Search 3.0, and this started in roughly 2004. This generation is all about leveraging the power of AI and machine learning to make search more predictive, proactive, and personalized than before. So with 3.0, the aim is to understand the user's needs even before they make the search. It's about anticipating what the user wants to know based on their current context, past behaviors, and even real-time situational data. So as a tangible example, if you're standing in front of a restaurant, a Search 3.0 engine might proactively provide you with reviews, menu, and opening hours for that restaurant. If you're reading an article about a specific topic, it might suggest related content or topics that you might be interested in. This means that Search 3.0 is not just about answering different questions, but about understanding the user's journey and providing relevant information at the right time. This, of course, requires advanced AI and machine learning algorithms capable of learning vast amounts of data and making accurate predictions about the person making the actual search. However, while these technologies have made search engines more efficient and personalized, they've also introduced the potential and very real situation of AI bias. So AI systems learn from the data they're trained on, and if that data contains biases, which can often be the case, given that it's very often a reflection of the historical and societal biases that we all carry, the AI systems can learn and replicate these biases. This becomes problematic when search engines, which historically have been our primary gateway to the world's information, start reflecting these biases. It can lead to a skewed representation of information, a reinforcing of stereotypes, and perpetuating harmful prejudices, as well as a numerous host of other issues. So a clear example, I kind of like these tangible examples in this podcast. So a clear example in Search 3.0, before we talk about generative AI searches, can be seen in the different search results shown for public figures, such as the infamous case of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign. So what did this look like? So people were actually claiming that when they searched for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump on Google during this race, the search engine displayed more positive articles and links about Hillary Clinton compared to Donald Trump. So critics have suggested that the algorithms used by Google, which incorporate a variety of factors, including like relevance, freshness of content, the reliability of the source, etc., may have actually favored certain political viewpoints over others. This would be an instance of algorithmic bias if this was the case, which is the manifestation of bias through the functioning of AI and machine learning, rather than the actual kind of political biases that are inherent in the programmers that are actually making the algorithms for the search engines. And if it is true, this could create a situation where users are not being presented with a balanced view of these figures, which could, and many people did argue, could influence public opinion. Furthermore, when users searched for either of these political candidates, the search engine took into account various factors, including the user's location, search history, and the prevalent narratives around these figures in different regions or among different user groups. So as a result of this, two users could search for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump and receive vastly different results because of that data. So this personalization can create echo chambers, or what I've heard it being called before, filter bubbles, where users are primarily exposed to information that aligns with their existing views and have limited access to diverse perspectives. So if a user already has a negative view of one of these two politicians, the search engine might primarily show negative articles reinforcing the user's existing bias. So I think this really highlights the potential for AI and machine learning to inadvertently amplify societal biases and underscores the importance of addressing these issues in the design and implementation of search technology. So all of that is occurring before generative AI. So Search 4.0, or generative AI search, goes beyond providing a list of websites and related information. It actually delivers specific, newly generated answers to whatever was searched for. The initial version of this is Google's featured snippets, which you have definitely come across if you've ever done a Google search, where a special box at the top of your Google search shows a description of the most relevant answer Google is able to produce. But that's a very limited case. But with the advent of ChatGPT, Bard, and other LLM competitors, we as users are starting to get accustomed to more robust, more nuanced, longer, and more fully fledged answers to the questions we ask from our keyboards. Rather than being pointed to a website or article or given a list of these, we are starting to expect multiple websites to be summarized based on what we've asked for in an easily readable and understandable presentation. So this is obviously tremendously powerful in the amount of time we are able to save by having a fully written out and nuanced and detailed answer in front of us seconds after asking, but it simultaneously increases or magnifies the AI bias problem. So traditional searches, as I mentioned, simply offer a list of sources for users to pick through and use their own judgment to decide on the validity of certain claims on websites. So in a sense, this search form indirectly generates the impacts of bias. But with generative AI, not only is the created information directly presented with no other alternatives, there are numerous other elements where bias can actually invade the generated content. So this magnification of the AI bias happens, I guess, in two separate instances. One is these kind of elements that I'll touch on in a second, where all the different kind of vectors or attack vectors of AI bias can actually infiltrate the generative AI. And then on the other side is the actual impact. So how the bias will actually create larger problems than just the previous kind of Search 3.0 example. So to start off with, let's talk about these different elements that bias can get into the generative AI. The first is, of course, training data. So AI systems learn from the data they are trained on. If the training data contains biases, these can be reflected in the AI's output. This can result in the perpetuation and amplification of existing biases, like I've talked about before. The second, which I've also briefly mentioned, is this algorithmic bias. The algorithms used to train AI models can also introduce bias. For instance, if an algorithm gives more weight to a certain type of information, this can bias the AI towards producing certain kinds of search results towards that. And then there's the interpretation of user input. Specifically, generative AI models like GPT-3 or GPT-4 use natural language processing to understand user questions and queries. The way these models interpret user input can also introduce bias. For example, if a user inputs a query that contains biased language or assumptions, the AI might actually generate biased search results based on that query. And the fourth is company influence. So the output content from a user's search query might heavily depend on the polarization of the company that created the generative AI search model to begin with. In other words, if the company has certain biases, these could potentially influence the AI's outputs without the company even understanding that those biases are in place. And then lastly, there is also a greater degree of trust that currently exists for new users with the information laid in front of them from these AI models. How does this happen? Having an AI generate relevant content in a few seconds is substantially more impressive than a simple listing of relevant websites. Even if both might have equal levels of bias, I argue that generated content will be accepted more easily than the traditional Search 3 options. But this trust may not last forever and may be one of the first large social impacts that will be felt. So if users perceive that AI systems are biased, it could undermine trust in these systems and in the information that they provide. This could actually result in users becoming more skeptical of AI-generated content and potentially even rejecting these technologies altogether, which I personally think would be to the greater detriment of society as a whole. Then there's information polarization. As AI systems become more adept at generating content, which is tailored to individual users, we risk creating echo chambers where users are only exposed to information that aligns with their existing beliefs and preferences. This could further exacerbate societal divisions and polarize public discourse. And then there's the issue of discrimination. So if AI systems reflect and amplify existing biases, it could lead to systematic discrimination against certain groups. For example, biased search results could influence public opinion, as we saw with the Hillary and Trump example, leading to real-world consequences such as discrimination in employment, housing, or the provision of different kinds of services across society. And then there's kind of a much higher level issue, which I think has been talked about a lot, but it definitely bears repeating, and this is the impacts on democracy. In the political sphere, biased AI systems could sway public opinion and influence elections. If search results consistently favor one political viewpoint or candidate over another, it could absolutely influence voters and undermine democratic processes. especially if the first impact of decreasing trust in AI systems doesn't come to pass, right? You can imagine a future scenario where a large segment of the population trusts in these AI generated articles or generated responses, and all of the responses are skewing towards one favored political party or one favored political individual. It's most likely that society will go along those lines, even if it might not be the best political party for that society. There's also economic impact that could be definitely experienced in the next couple of years. Specifically within the business world, bias in AI systems could lead, very similar to the favoring of one political candidate or another, to unfair competitive advantages or disadvantages for certain companies. Example, if an AI system consistently ranks certain companies or products higher than others due to some sort of implicit bias, it could influence consumer behavior and market dynamics. So those are some of the kind of larger impacts that are going to be substantially more magnified than what we've experienced in the Search 3.0 era. But before concluding, I think there's still a couple other smaller impacts that might actually be more relevant or tangible to the work that you are doing in your work or for your business that is relevant to talk about. So users may actually stop visiting websites and interacting with web ads altogether if they receive content in a ChatGPT-like interface where there are zero distractions, which I think we can all agree is significantly better. And this could actually have significant implications for online advertising and other revenue models. And in that similar vein of things, the popularity of search engine giants like Google, DuckDuckGo, and Brave, I think is actually going to be decreasing significantly over the next couple of years if these generative AI competitors keep seeing more and more uses. And with this, ad revenue collected from search, which forms a significant part of these companies' profits, could also decline. But I think this kind of goes down a certain path of the shifting landscape between Google and OpenAI, and whether OpenAI is going to be the Google disruptor. I think I've talked about this on a couple episodes before, but it's a little bit out of scope here. Generally speaking, we're looking at a little bit of a shift in how searches function, and if you're a business that is using Google Ads, for instance, to get your brand presence out there a little bit more, it might be that you need to shift up your strategy over the next couple of years, again, if generative AI overtakes search engines as a kind of dominant way that we all extract information from the internet. So to conclude, while generative AI search holds the potential to revolutionize the way we access online information, it also presents challenges around AI bias and the reshaping of the digital landscape. As such, I think it's really crucial to address these concerns proactively with regulatory oversight and ethical guidelines to ensure that this technology serves society in a fair and unbiased manner, and also to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that we've experienced with the previous Search 3.0 model, which I've touched on briefly in this podcast episode. So to mitigate these potential impacts, it's essential to take steps to address AI bias. This could involve more diverse and representative training data, which, granted, is a fair, challenging task in and of itself. We could be developing and implementing algorithms that are transparent and can be audited for bias. And of course, establishing clear guidelines and regulations for the use of AI in areas such as search. And by doing so, we can harness the benefits of AI while minimizing the risks of the bias. But I don't think that we'll be existing in a world where bias is completely removed from these very powerful AI tools. As it was discussed at the beginning, because a lot of these biases are simply a mirroring of what we are experiencing in society and in culture at a large part. And no, the irony of using ChatGPT to help write out and research this week's topic is not really lost on me. Even if I did still initially go to Google and get some rough initial ideas, I think that this deeply ingrained behavior of using Google first is definitely going to shift to using ChatGPT first as I continue to create and research podcast episodes into the future, specifically because it is so much easier to research and write a script than it was previously just by using Google and going through the dozens of articles that I would need to in order to write a compelling and properly researched podcast episode. But we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. Well, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living at the highest standard of living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.